You're listening to Hanging, an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose, California.
Last time on Hanging.
And I said, Josh is dead, isn't he? And he said, yes.
KW didn't show love to Josh. You know, that wasn't him.
KW was trying to discipline a difficult child in a style that nobody would have made a big fuss about 20, 30 years earlier. He was a tough guy. His kid was going to be a tough kid.
They asked me if I felt that KW was capable of, did I think KW murdered Josh?
Just because they had a prior history doesn't mean that necessarily somebody killed somebody.
I can't stop thinking about Josh.
Welcome back to the Mercury News podcast series, Hanging, the mysterious case of the boy in the barn. I'm Julia Prodis Sulek.
Chapter 2.
Emergency vehicles filled Columbet Avenue that winter evening in 1989, the night 10-year-old Joshua Klaver was found hanging in his family's barn. As law enforcement officers began to arrive, just about every one of them was a friend or acquaintance of Josh's father, KW Klaver, a Santa Clara County Sheriff's deputy.
Obviously, I mean, the people that were down there that responded to the scene that evening, I'm sure all were very friendly with Klaver and knew him well, you know.
That's retired Sergeant Jerry Egge. He knew KW too, but was not at the barn that Monday night at the end of January. Egge was a homicide detective, and the only reason he would have been called out was if the deputies that night thought there was something suspicious about Josh's death, something other than suicide. Did the sheriff's deputies who responded to the Klaver barn that night quickly disregard any other possible explanation for Josh's death? That was a big question on my mind as I set out to try to answer something even more fundamental. Was justice done 28 years ago in the barn in San Martin? Ultimately, I'd find myself puzzling over a few other mysteries, like, did investigators dismiss disturbing information about KW that didn't fit the image they had of their fellow deputy? And what happened to a key piece of evidence that seemed to mysteriously disappear? Joe Fortino was one of the first deputies to reach the home in San Martin, California, a small town 30 miles south of San Jose. He and KW were close colleagues and often spent coffee breaks together. KW was upset and perspiring that night when Fortino encountered him in the driveway.
I believe fire and ambulance was there. And I remember standing in the driveway, and I remember KW coming out and being all sweaty and upset and saying, you know, we lost him. Something like we lost him, didn't we? We lost him. And I said, you know, it's not over till it's over, KW.
There's always been a bond among deputies in the South County. Many live or work in the rural towns of Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy. Fortino and Louis Mitri, another deputy who arrived at the barn that night, became next-door neighbors on 5-acre parcels not far from the Klaver place. They're both retired now. Like KW, these are the kinds of guys who drive trucks, raise livestock, and like to work the land. Josh's mother, Kathy Atkins, has insisted for years to anyone who would listen that the tight-knit fraternity of law enforcement failed to thoroughly investigate Josh's death. She accused KW's fellow deputies of ignoring red flags that should have triggered a closer look, especially KW's documented history of abusing Josh. At the viewing before Josh's funeral, Kathy remembers how law enforcement filled the chapel.
The Klavers had their family in all the pews up front, and the rest of the place was filled with sheriff's deputies. And there was nowhere for me to sit. They had my family. We were standing out in the lobby of the chapel, and Josh's body's up in the casket, and I walked up and I had to walk through that room. Klaver sitting there.
KW's first wife, Judy, who helped raise Josh when he was a toddler, also suspects that the connection among deputies may have influenced the investigation.
Seems like the sheriff department came in there and says, "Oh, you're one of us. Oh, I feel bad for you, know, your son died. Okay." Nobody looked into anything. Nobody looked into the abuse prior to that. Nobody looked into anything that led up to that.
Was that really true? Did KW's fellow deputies give him a pass that night? Did they follow protocol, do their jobs? I set out to get some answers, but one thing I would hear again and again was undeniable.
Justice cannot be done if the police don't do their job initially the way they're supposed to do it.
That's Vernon Geberth, a former New York City police commander who literally wrote the book on homicide investigations that police departments across the country use in their training. He points to 7 major mistakes in suicide investigations. Mistake number 1, assuming the case is a suicide based on the initial report. Mistake number 2, investigators take shortcuts when they hear suicide. Mistake number 3, all death inquiries should be conducted as homicide investigations until the facts prove differently. So, were mistakes made when KW's fellow deputies showed up at the barn to investigate Josh's death? The police reports from back then should have provided some of the answers. But even though the case is nearly 3 decades old, the sheriff's department refused to release them, saying it had once again become an ongoing investigation. And believe me, I asked and asked and asked. Our lawyer asked too. And again, the agencies involved in Josh's death refused to release the original reports. So instead, I tracked down deputies and other officials involved in the case back then. I had to find out if flaws with the initial investigation into Josh's death back in 1989 had something to do with the sheriff's office reopening the probe twice, first in 1990 and then again in 2014. So it became a game of Clue, finding a sergeant's name in an old newspaper clipping, hoping he would answer, asking for more names, more addresses, more memories. Would any of these people still live in the area? Would they remember? You might think that, from the outset, a sheriff's department would increase scrutiny of a case involving one of its own. But after I reached out to Bob Winter, the sheriff at the time of Josh's death, he's retired now and living in the mountains of Northern California, it became clear that didn't happen.
KW was not just one of my employees, he was a friend of mine. And he was, of course, devastated by the loss. But I don't know, what else can I tell you?
Winter lived in the South County, too, at the time, and ran some cattle on his place in Gilroy. KW, who had a custom butcher business on the side, would slaughter a steer for him from time to time.
Can you tell me about your friendship with him? What kind of guy was he? And
he was Mr. Independence. He was very reliable, but he wanted to live his own life, and he was on a rural beat because of his competence and his reliability.
Do you remember ever having any trouble with him, or?
None at all.
He was in a custody battle at the time over his son Josh when Josh was found hanging. Were you aware of that, or?
No, I wasn't. He kept it to himself.
The former sheriff said he didn't get involved personally in the investigation. He knew nothing about the custody fight, he said, and nothing about past child abuse either. Winter retired later that same year, but I had to ask.
I mean, it never crossed your mind that it was anything other than a suicide?
No.
Okay. Do you think that's something that maybe should have been looked at more closely, the fact that it was the son of a sheriff's deputy and, you know, probably guys he knew well were responding to the scene?
No, that never occurred to me.
Just to help you keep track here, we're hearing from 3 members of the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office from back then. Bob Winter, the sheriff at the time, Deputy Joe Fortino, who was coffee break buddies with KW and responded to the 911 call, and Sergeant Eggy, the homicide detective who was not called to the barn that night, but visited KW days later. We also heard from Eggy in Chapter 1. He was the one quoted in the San Jose Mercury News in 1989, explaining that Josh had hung himself because he was so distraught over his parents' custody battle.
I felt sorry for the family. I felt sorry for the boy. I felt sorry for KW.
That's Sergeant Eggy again.
Anybody in the sheriff's department at that time was a family member, you know. Not to say I wouldn't convict them of crime, because I've investigated a lot of bad cops. You know.
But no one suspected him, so no one knew.
Nobody suspected him.
I have to say, the former sheriff and deputies who talked to me were all surprisingly candid. I mean, here I am, a reporter calling them and knocking on their doors, putting them on the spot, really pressing them about a case, 3 decades later?
Do you remember where he pointed to where Josh had hung himself?
No, I just remember that we kind of looked through the door and he says, this is where it occurred or something like that, you know.
Through the door, or what kind of door?
Ma'am, I don't remember. That was 20-some years ago. I don't know. Did it have knot holes in it? Was it splintered? Was it steel? Was it have a window? I don't know.
Okay. I just thought I'd ask.
I mean, you're getting into this. Do you remember what you were doing 20 years ago? What kind of door was on your grandmother's house?
I get it. And I appreciate you, digging as deep as you can into that, that long ago.
With one notable exception, these guys weren't defensive. If I was looking for a cover-up, I found no clear signs of it. But I did find that plenty of things they told me were, kind of stunning. So, what do you think of KW? Do you believe him?
Yeah, I don't think that no.
I spoke twice to Joe Fortino, one of the deputies at the Klaver barn that night. Once on the phone and again in person at his ranch in Gilroy. It's a beautiful place. Serpentine country roads cut through the county's eastern foothills, golden and studded with California live oaks. Wearing a faded Del Toro trucking ball cap, he leaned against his big white truck at the end of the driveway, and we discussed what he remembered.
He fought for custody of that kid. He wanted that kid. He felt, the kid was developing well. He was had his own rabbits and this and that, and he was proud of him. He would brag about him and stuff, that he was, doing well and stuff. But the downside was it was constantly tug of war back and forth.
What did he say about that? You said you'd meet for coffee or whatever and kind of shoot the breeze.
Yeah, we didn't have in-depth conversation about it. He'd say things like, the bitch is trying to get custody of the kid. It's all about money, blah, 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 whatever, that kind of stuff. It's about more than the kid. It's about, monthly support and all this stuff.
And you believed him?
Yeah, it seemed like that. Yeah.
Fortino told me that he knew KW well back in the day, but he considered him a little too macho. Still, the two of them have kept up with emails and jokes over the years, and he told me he made it a point to give KW a call after we first talked, to tip him off that a reporter was poking around. Just tell me the story. You said you called KW after I talked to you. So tell me what you said.
I called him and said, hey, KW, heads up. There's a reporter, an investigative reporter, is looking into the death of your late son. And I said, have you heard of anything? And he says, no. He said, every year she causes some shit about the time that the kid, Josh, was it Josh? Yeah, that the kid passed away.
The she he is talking about there is Josh's mother.
Basically, that she's always stirring the crap from time to time. And he said, thanks for the heads up. And he didn't seem concerned about it, and that was the end of it.
And here's the thing. Not only was Fortino aware of the custody battle over Josh when he showed up at the barn that night, but he knew about the child abuse allegations too. KW had told Fortino himself. This time we discussed it on the phone, so sorry it's a little harder to hear.
Did you ever hear any allegations that KW, that the mother of the boy had accused him of child abuse, that KW had smacked Josh around and, kicked him down steps?
Klaver, yeah. KW or Klaver shared some of that with me. Yeah, that that was some of the allegations in the court issues. But here again, I've never witnessed it.
And you remember KW saying that that wasn't true, or that she was exaggerating, or what?
Yeah, you can say it was a bunch of BS and that she was just stack of things to get custody. You would also say that the child wanted to stay with him.
That may have been tough to hear, so I'll repeat it. Fortino said he never witnessed any abuse. KW told him it was a bunch of BS, and she was stacking things against him to get custody. KW would also say the child wanted to stay with him.
So when the body is found and there had been some of these allegations of abuse, was there any thought that maybe, and in the midst of this big custody thing, that maybe he met with foul play, that the boy, that it wasn't suicide?
I had no information on that. Yeah, I really don't. I did not witness anything. I didn't, visit with him at the house, that type of thing. So I didn't really know. I have no independent knowledge of if the allegations were true or false.
But when the boy was found dead and the mom had accused KW of abusing him, there were no red flags that went off that,
not to my knowledge. Yeah.
I mean, do we need to do any further investigation that maybe it's not as it appears?
I'd have to defer to Louis Mitri and his report. I'm sure you can get a copy of that, huh?
Well, I tried, remember, with no luck. So here we are, a sheriff's deputy who knew KW had been accused of child abuse, but for whatever reason, didn't think it was relevant. Was it? I asked Geberth, the New York City investigator.
Given the dynamics of this event, child custody situation, the emotion, I would have jumped on that in the media. There's too many red flags here. And I really feel sorry for that little boy.
KW has never been arrested or charged with abusing Josh. But as we learned in Chapter 1, I had found 8 separate acts of abuse documented by a judge in 1986 in a Santa Clara County family court file. They included whipping him with a belt, striking him across the face, and kicking him. But Sergeant Eggy had no memory of any abuse by KW whatsoever when I dropped by his house. He only remembers being told of some kind of incident at Josh's school. That's when, as we learned in Chapter 1, Josh told someone at school that his dad had knocked him down some steps, that he was bruised, and he was afraid to go home.
I remember just vaguely that there was some problems at the school. The father came over there one time and there was a problem, but nothing to indicate any violence against the boy or anything.
He doesn't recall what Josh's stepfather, Kathy's husband Dennis Atkins, remembers, that he called Sergeant Eggy repeatedly after Josh's death, and he showed up at his office to beg for a deeper investigation. Not only had Josh been abused by KW, Dennis said, but Josh was supposed to speak in private to a judge the next morning, and perhaps tell the court, for the first time, with whom he wanted to live.
I kept calling Sergeant Eggy's. I said, we'll make ourselves available. When do you want to talk? And they never came to us in question. I actually ended up going to their office and sitting down. I think it was on that Thursday. I'm not sure, exactly which day it was. I think it was on that Thursday. I went to their office there, and they said that they were wrapping up the thing. They were just waiting for the toxicology reports, and that they had the real crimes to investigate.
Eggy insists he never would have said something like that to a grieving parent, but he does remember the report of Josh's death crossing his desk a few days later.
There was no thought in my mind that it was going to be a homicide or anything like that. I didn't, I knew Klaver and I knew how he reacted around people. I've never seen him lose his temper or be violent, ever.
Not only had the deputies at the scene found nothing suspicious, Sergeant Eggy told me, but the coroner who performed the autopsy found no obvious signs of foul play or a struggle. Eggy decided to head to KW's a few days after Josh's death anyway, to express his condolences and take a look for himself. As he put it, it was a family member type thing. When Eggy met with KW, the two of them walked through the barn together. KW pointed out where Josh had been hanging. Eggy, though, said he was reluctant to ask many questions.
I felt kind of bad asking him about when he was broken up, when I didn't press him for the facts of it, exactly how did you cut him down, how did you get it down, type of things like that. No, I didn't press him.
Why didn't you press him?
Probably a couple of things because of a report. There's been 5 days later, he was really broken up. I'd already found out from the coroner had ruled it a suicide. And I can't even remember how long it was after that I got the call about the custody problems.
And there was something else about KW when they were in the barn together.
I can't see him as being that good of an actor when I was down there. When he was very, obviously later on, maybe he was angry at the time, but I'm not.
How would you describe him then?
He was heartbroken. He was heartbroken and depressed, obviously, And if that was a put on, he convinced me.
What's interesting, though, is that despite Eggy's belief that Josh had indeed killed himself, he told me that something has always bothered him about the case.
I said, I need to talk to some people on this. This is weird, 10-year-old.
But quickly you realized that it was
Well, I accepted it as a suicide. With the reports that I had from the coroners and from the people that were on the scene and stuff like that, the officers and the sergeant that were on the scene and stuff like that. But it's always been a case that kind of bothered me.
Is it because it's a 10-year-old or because it seems so unlikely that maybe something else happened?
I've never seen anybody that young kill themselves, But I have seen them a few years older, 14, 15, 16 years old, just being depressed or about whatever their life was like, drugs and whatever.
But it bothered you because such a young kid killed himself, or because it was so unusual that you thought, how could that really be? Maybe it was something else.
That's a good question. But at the time, all I can tell you is I felt so sorry for the kid. I knew and after I found out family problems, well, there's thousands of families that have domestic problems, And there was nothing to indicate, from as far as I knew, that it would be a homicide other than the mother-father thing or the custody thing. Would I kill my son because my wife wanted to take him away? No. A 10-year-old, no.
The hypothetical motive that Eggy tossed out and quickly dismissed in our conversation was nothing more than speculation, and it's difficult to even begin to comprehend why any father might kill a son. But investigators are supposed to contemplate the unthinkable. A fit of rage during an argument, a need to keep something silent, a punishment gone too far, an accidental killing staged as a suicide? I asked Geberth what he thought, and while he only knew what I had shared about Josh's case, he told me this.
All these questions, Julia, go back to the fact that the initial investigation at the scene was incomplete. And if they did respond to that location and accept the fact that it was a suicide based on face value, they didn't do anything else they're supposed to do. And that's the problem with these kinds of cases. If you don't do your job the way you're supposed to do it, you leave too many unanswered questions. And you can't possibly recreate a scene without all the elements from the original scene. So I see this as a problem.
Again, without access to the original sheriff's report, it's difficult to determine exactly what the deputies did or didn't do that night. I was left piecing together information from authorities who had access to the report or knew the case from the past. I learned deputies had taken some measurements, but memories were fuzzy about photos. If they were taken that night, they don't seem to exist today. I also learned something really unusual about a crucial piece of evidence, something that never made its way to the coroner for the autopsy the morning after Josh's death. The rope. It seemed to, vanish?
One of the questions in this case is what happened to the rope? Was there any indication or even jogging your memory if the rope was present during the autopsy?
No, the rope had been removed at the scene and had not been submitted to the investigator. So by the time that I saw the child, there was no rope with the body.
That's Dr. Parviz Paktaman, the assistant medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Josh's body back in 1989. He's retired now and living in the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains. He hadn't worked for the coroner for 16 years when I called and didn't remember the case at first. But he offered to go down to the medical examiner's office and review the file. And one thing he told me was that, yes, in a hanging death, the rope should indeed stay with the body.
Usually it should be submitted to the coroner's office, but it was not.
What happened to the rope is an intriguing question, but there's so many others too. If you didn't have the rope, how would you know whether it was strong enough or pliable enough for Josh to tie a sturdy knot and hang himself? The one thing I was told from the report about the rope was that it was woven and 8 feet long, but that's it. If you didn't have the rope or photos of it, how could you know whether the knot was the work of a 10-year-old boy or whether it was tied at all? And how unusual was it for the rope not to end up with the coroner for the autopsy? I asked the sheriff back then, Bob Winter.
There's a mystery of what happened to the rope or whether it was booked into evidence or not. Do you have a sense with suicides at the time if the rope should stay with the body or be part of the evidence collected?
I really couldn't comment on that. That's up to the investigators.
Deputy Fortino said it wasn't his responsibility to collect the rope. It was probably Deputy Louis Mitri's. Remember, Mitri lives right next door to Fortino on a matching 5-acre ranch in Gilroy. I rang the intercom at the base of his long driveway, but he didn't answer. When I reached him by phone from my car, let's just say he wasn't as cooperative as his colleagues. I'm not going to talk, he told me. The rope was documented in the report, he said, and as far as he remembers, was taken into evidence. When I tried to ask him a few more questions, he told me he didn't want to get involved anymore. Stop it, he told me. Behave. Then he hung up. Do you remember anything about the rope or about, if it was tied?
I never even saw the rope. I never saw it.
This is Sergeant Eggy again. Did you know what happened to the rope, or did you ask to see the rope?
No, I didn't. I never saw the rope.
Do you know if it was ever...
I'm sure it probably went with the coroner, maybe.
It never did.
It didn't.
Mm-mm.
Had this case come in today, we would have required the rope. We would have looked at the rope.
That's Dr. Michelle Jordan, Santa Clara County's current medical examiner, who 25 years later would take another look at the case. And why is the rope important?
The ligatures are always important to look at by the medical examiner to ensure to match it with the injury that's observed on the neck.
Even without the rope, Dr. Paktaman said he measured the bruises on Josh's neck, noting the well-defined half-inch abrasion mark that circled his upper neck. He also jotted down other unexplained marks, ill-defined bruising on his front right shoulder, and abrasions and bruise marks covering his kneecaps. He didn't consider them signs of abuse or foul play.
My impression has been that this was a suicide, and that's it.
Just to be clear, his impression, he said, was that this was a suicide, and that's it. Honestly, I had to believe that a more solid investigation from the start might have saved everyone from years of speculation and pain. Perhaps it might have implicated Josh's father, but just as importantly, it could have also established once and for all, decades ago, that Josh committed suicide and could have saved KW from so much suspicion. Sergeant Eggy acknowledges that more should have been done from the start. Looking back, do you have any regret that maybe you should have done a more thorough investigation?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what else I could have learned, though, you know. Obviously, there was only 2 people involved, if there was. And you're not able to prove anything like that in court. But I still don't think KW had anything to do with it.
So what did this all mean? Josh's mother and stepfather say they were ignored when they brought up KW's past abuse. The original investigators, including sheriff's deputies and a medical examiner, say nothing looks suspicious. I needed to find someone who wasn't so personally tied to the case. I found that person watering the side yard of his suburban home in San Jose's Almaden Valley. Dale Sanderson, a retired Santa Clara County Deputy District Attorney. He remembered Josh's case right away. He said he was often asked to look into cold cases. Josh's death was one of them. Sanderson was reluctant to talk about the case at first, since he hadn't seen the file in years, but it certainly has stayed with him.
This was one of the cases that, at least in my mind, was shelved, for another day. And that's one of like 3 or 4 that memory services, in my opinion, were completely unresolved.
Sorry, you're going to hear a lot of my note-taking on this interview. So, when the coroner said it was a suicide, you didn't look at the evidence and go, oh yeah, clearly it was a suicide.
Coroner's reports, it's not like I take them with a grain of salt. I mean, they're really good evidence. They give you the, pathological evidence you need to be able to evaluate a case. But they're not the end-all, and they never have been.
Sanderson told me, just because you find a child hanging, how is it you know the child committed suicide? In other words, how do you know whether he hung himself or was hung at the hands of another?
I mean, how's the coroner going to know that?
Sanderson doesn't blame the sheriff's office for gathering little information about that night.
I won't criticize the SO, but you got to remember, deputies show up to a dead body case.
Yeah.
And they find out it's KW and Bobby Klaver. I mean, KW's a deputy sheriff.
Right.
They're obviously distraught. They just lost a child.
Right.
And so they're going to treat it like, here are grieving parents. The child's just committed suicide. And I don't think they're thinking along the lines that we have to do everything we can to secure a crime scene.
But Sanderson agreed with the New York City detective. If the investigation isn't done properly at the start, well, good luck getting it right later. Why do you think a thorough investigation wasn't done on this case?
Well, when I say thorough, it's just, initially they treated it, I'm not going to say with kid gloves, but they treated it as a suicide. So anytime you have a period of time go by before you go back and you fully investigate it, if we're going to call it a suicide, let's make sure we fully investigate it before we do. So what I mean by a thorough investigation, all this stuff wasn't done initially, because you only get one shot at a crime scene, that's it. After that, it's been compromised. I mean, other people have been through it, things could have been changed, things could have been altered, you never know, what the state of it is. Same goes with witnesses. Usually the earlier you get to the witnesses, the better information, the more accurate and thorough information you're going to get, rather than them trying to digest what happened. Time goes by, biases come into play, they get influenced, by even other people. And so it's more difficult to do a thorough and complete investigation once you let any time period go by.
There's something else that Sanderson always wondered about. Bobby Klaver, KW's wife at the time, who came home to the tragedy. From reading the case report back then, Sanderson said, she certainly didn't have a lot to say.
Bobby Klaver, obviously. To me, I always thought she was an untapped source, if not wealth of information.
Someone should talk to her, he told me, about her husband, about what happened that night. Next on Hanging.
I know what happened. That's how I found out, because I know what happened to your son about his death, and I have stuff to tell you.
Apparently you're bothering someone here in Winona, and they don't appreciate it. I know that you guys are from California and trying to get some interviews with this one person.
Dear Bobby, I'm sorry I upset you when I knocked on your door this morning. I can't imagine the enduring pain of losing Josh and coming upon what you did that night.
KW had the big sack of feed over his shoulder. All of a sudden, the rabbit feed was on the ground, and KW said, "Oh my God, Josh."
Do you think he killed Josh? Hanging is an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose. This podcast was hosted and reported by Julia Prodis Sulek. That's me. It was produced by my editor, Mike Frankel, and our sound engineer, Paul Baca. Videos and photography by Lipo Ching. Additional video production by Tor Haugen and Sarah Dussault. Our website is designed by Pi, and Mike Mayer designed the series for the newspaper. Bert Robinson is our managing editor, and Neil Chase is our executive editor. To make sure you hear every chapter, subscribe to Hanging wherever you get your podcasts. To see photos, videos, and documents, and to read the series and comment on this podcast, go to www.mercurynews.com/hanging. That's Mercury, like the planet, news.com/hanging. Thanks for listening.